Thanks very much, Malcolm, for that introduction. Although, as it happened, when I was president of the National Union of Students, I was never arrested, still less charged with no doubt a multiplicity of offences that I may or may not have committed. Anyway, so as I used to say in the police courts, nothing known. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much to the RSA for the invitation. In 1754, when this society was founded, 60% of those in jail were debtors. Many of the remainder were awaiting trial, with the sentences available split largely between transportation to the colonies, flogging and branding, hard labour, or the gallows. Until the late 18th century, the justice system centred around crimes against property rather than the person. And beyond the maintenance of the king's peace, there was little regard either to the wrongs committed against wider society or for the punishment handed down to act as anything other than a deterrent for the offender and other potential criminals. It was not until 1779, with the passing of the Penitentiary Act, that incarceration was made the main form of punishment and rehabilitation began to be a function of all prisons. From this base, aided by the vision and dedication of great penal reformers, the prison system has experienced a gradual move towards correction as well as punishment, developing institutions to help turn lives around for the well-being not just of the offender, but of society as a whole. From its inception 250 years ago to the launch of the Prison Learning Network today, the Royal Society of Arts has been a champion of the values of the Enlightenment as well as of enlightened values. It's a history of working for the common good for the benefit of society. Indeed, there is a somewhat eerie prescience about the RSA's early commitment to what we now call carbon offsetting, which dates back to 1770. Back in 1770, the RSA had twin projects to encourage the reduction of smoke emissions on the one hand and the promotion of tree planting on the other. A little bit of history which could come as a very inconvenient truth to Al Gore, espousing exactly the same thing 250 years later as something original. But in essence, my theme this morning is the common good, and specifically how the criminal justice system can better work to this end. I'm going to look at how the courts, prisons, and probation services operate and discuss how I believe that the system should better match the public expectations of it. Lord Denning once said that justice is rooted in confidence. Justice may indeed be administered by the courts in prisons through community punishments through probation, but unless people can see and experience for themselves that justice is being done in their interests, confidence will be that much lower. That most famous dictum that justice must not only be done but be seen to be done is fundamental to the public's confidence in the system. And over the past decade, there has been substantial and successful reform to the criminal justice system. But much of what has been done, whilst invaluable, has been structural or institutional. For instance, as Home Secretary, I created the Youth Justice Board to provide some very substantial reforms of the youth justice system. We've invested in record numbers of police, with 14,000 extra police, 16,000 PCSOs. The court system has undergone a prolonged period of change, with the creation of Her Majesty's Court Service and the introduction of much improved court services, particularly to make the experience quicker and simpler, especially for victims and for witnesses. So victims' impact statements are now routinely submitted to the court. There are special areas for victims in all Crown and major magistrates' courts. Well-trained police family liaison officers provide an invaluable support to families in murder and other cases of serious violence. The Crown Prosecution Service has itself undergone a quiet revolution, with the interests of the victim centre stage and prosecutors making it their business to speak to prosecution witnesses, not to coach them, but to reassure them. The nature of regimes in prison is a great deal better than it was even a decade ago. More decent, more humane, more constructive, whilst probation has become much more focused on getting the offender to mend his or her ways. And such widespread reform has greatly improved the administration and operation of the justice system and has contributed in no small part to the 30% drop in crime, which has taken place over the last 11 years, an equivalent drop to in violent crime, and the lowest chance of becoming a victim of crime since accurate recording began in 1981. But as I argued in a recent speech at The Guardian, there remains a significant gap between the reality of crime and how it is perceived. The result is that substantial progress which has been made by almost any objective measure has not been translated into a corresponding increase in community confidence. And the challenge for the next stage of criminal justice reform is not simply to narrow this gap. Much more is required. What is needed is to continue the momentum of reform in the culture of public services, which we've seen, for example, in education and health, to the entire criminal justice system, including the courts, the prisons, and the probation services. Public confidence will rise when local people can see justice in action in their streets, their towns, their communities, when local people feel that the justice system is working more effectively for them. And this morning I want to go into more detail about how we intend to bring about this change, looking at the courts, prisons and probation, and finally at how the different parts of the criminal justice system can work better together and with the public as part of a community justice coalition. From my brief experience at the criminal bar in the 1970s, but from my mailbag and constituency meetings as an MP, it was very clear through the 70s and 80s that the operation of the courts was a frustration to many who came across it, be that as witness, defendant, magistrate or prosecutor. There was a widespread belief that processes and procedures were convoluted, inefficient and slow, and whilst the court itself often received remote and isolated, somewhere where justice was done unto a community, not necessarily for a community. It may sound a semantic point, but I think it's very important. Indeed, some describe the courts, particularly the criminal courts, as a secret garden, publicly accessible, but a mystery to many. And there are two issues here, both with a bearing on community confidence. First, a perception that slow and complex practices sent out a strong signal that justice was being done in the name of the professionals and not the public. Second, that there was attitudinally a separation, the sense that whilst the criminal justice system had above all to be alive to the fundamental values of the rule of law, it did not have to do that in a way which diminished the interests of the law-abiding public or the taxpayer whom it's there to serve and who pays for it. Now, we've gone quite some way to address the first problem with the introduction of better court administration, faster trials, fewer redundant hearings, more explanations of what's going on for victims and witnesses. And the principles of simple, speedy, summary justice, CJSSS, have now been adopted in every magistrates' court in the country. And the results are very positive. A 30% increase in guilty pleas at first hearing, with 60% of guilty pleas dealt with on that day, and a 70% reduction in adjournments at the first hearing. For this, the magistrates, district judges and court staff deserve and should receive great thanks. The second issue, however, necessitates an even greater change. It's about a change in attitude which requires the criminal justice system to see itself as a public service and to see itself more clearly working for the local community and for the taxpayer. In this sense, the local court, or the prison for that matter, should be no different from the local school or hospital or health centre. Public sector reform allied with record investment has transformed the provision of health and education. There's no question about that. There is more choice, greater personalisation, shorter waiting times, better results, more localism. And these are benefits in which everyone can share.